Hello, my name is Yahya, and welcome to my podcast, in which we will speak about the Muslim perspective of India, in which we will try and chronologically go through the history of India from the eyes of the Muslims, in which we have a number of sources where we can derive our history from. First and foremost is from its original source, from Quran and Hadith, where our story actually begins. When we look at Arabia in the sense that we look at it from a historical point of view, um, it seems to be one of the worst places to start um, a journey in which you have really nothing to really start with. And civilization, if you were to call it that, lived in a somewhat of a Bronze Era type existence in which people were still living in mud huts, no proper ironmongery of any sort, no actual agricultural techniques that were really employed at that time. It's a very interesting concept that one of the hadiths that would relate to them, that they would be existing on two black things. One would be the dates of Arabia, and the other the water itself. And we can also tell from other histories, religion is a very important thing inside human existence, in which you can tell the sociological structure of a place or a city or a town or a country itself. But when we look at Arabia itself, it looks like it has borrowed a lot of it from Christian sources, and also heavily induced from the Persian pantheon. Case in point, when we look at Lat, Uzza, and Muzza, who seem to be one of the three primary gods of Arabia at that time, you see very close parallels to Ishtar from the Persian pantheon, who we know is the god of love and warfare. As we see from many of their own narrations from Hadith and Quran, and also from their own poems. A very interesting book I would advise all people to read if you were interested in pre-Islamical society in Arabia would be the Book of Idols, Kitabul Asnan, sorry about that, by Hisham ibn al-Qalbi. In that, it relates a number of broken up into a number of sections, in which one is told the perspective of each god. For example, we have Latuz and Muzza, which is the most common one, but there were also others as well, in which they were also venerated. For example, Al-Qalais and Al-Fas and Al-Yaqub, Nasr, Riyam, Mana, Israf and Naila. A number of we know a number of these idols is because during the Hajj season of farewell Hajj as we know it, a lot of customs and ideas of the Hajj originated from Abraham himself, but it seems like through the ages it had become twisted and morphed. For example, the killing of a animal to signify the ending of your pilgrimage, as most Muslims do. But during the time of pre-Islamic Arabia, you would do the same thing. For example, you would have to first go get an animal and then place the animal between two idols that will be facing yourself, and then the animal would be sacrificed in that God's name, and then you would shave your head. It's very akin to what we do as Muslims. We would kill an animal and shave your head. So there were very close parallels in regards to the Hajj, and from the Hajj we also saw a number of morphed ideas, as the Hadith puts in, the Quran puts it, that things from the Abraham time changed over to Prophet's Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time, in which that a number of things were changing over. For example, running from Safa to Marwa. During this time, that the Sahabas and the companions of that Prophet, they would mention that we can't run Safa and Marwa because it was a custom of the old times, the era of Jahiliyat, as they would say, because they would run for the sake of Israf and Naila. If you were to know more about that story, I would preferably tell you to read it yourself because it's a bit R-rated, as one might say. So you must be thinking now, why am I mentioning these gods and pre-Islamic Arabian ideas? It's very interesting to say that things move as the history of humankind is migration. Ideas move from one place to the other. Arabs in themselves, because of the hostile environment that they lived in, things couldn't be made like in other places, things couldn't be grown. So quite a lot of their things were imported. So they would import certain types of grain, certain products that couldn't be brought. So they would go to, for example, we see that they used to go to Syria and maybe go down to the coast of Yemen, and other traders would travel further at sea. You see that, for example, in which when the companions of the Prophet ﷺ went to Ethiopia, they got a audience with the king pretty fast within the day. So if you didn't have any type of connection with Ethiopia, how would you get an audience with the king that fast? Arabians would move from back and forth. During this time period, there was a sense of a trading unit, one might call it a Silk Road. This is the very beginnings of the Silk Road, where people would travel from one place to the other, but not in the sense of as we know it as the pinnacle of the Silk Road, where things would start in China and end up in Vienna and vice versa. These routes that the Arabians used was not just exclusively to land, as the Arabs are accustomed to land travel, but there seems to be some kind of evidence that they were somewhat seafaring at the same time. Case in point, in which incense was used quite readily in pagan worship, as it is used in pagan worship throughout the world still. We see evidence and archaeological evidence of incense holders and other types of incense being burnt. We also see evidence in which the Prophet Muhammad has also mentioned India. In this sense, I believe there are a number of hadith that pertain to India. They go as follows from Sahih Muslim. There is a cool breeze coming from there, so i.e. India, referring to Adam alayhi salam himself. Number 2, there are 7 diseases that can be cured from Indian incense. Also to the fact that a number of people would say Ghazwa Hind as well, the invasion or conquest or liberation of India, however you want to spin that. So we can see that people of Arabia did know about India, and things from India did used to come to Arabia, as Arabia was known for leather at that time. So we can safely establish that the Arabs were natural traders, in which they would go from place to place. Now we take that and we mix in the revelation of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his efforts of 23 years of changing the hearts and minds of the people of the Hijaz area, as they would describe themselves to be an ignorant or downtrodden people. Prophet Muhammad sought to enlighten and embolden them to new heights as the Arabians have never seen themselves before. And we saw that from a historical point of view. Traditionally, Arabia was from tribal location to tribal location. People would live in small groups or maybe small towns. We see that the superpowers at the time, the Arabians, were disconcerted with them to somewhat a degree. So the Persian and the Byzantine Empire, or the Christian Empire one might say, did not really interfere with Arabian affairs to a point. They would use proxy warfare, so they would hire a king to vest in their interest in that location. For example, the Byzantines would pay a certain tribal leader or a king of Northern Arabia to somewhat drive out Persian influence to that place, and vice versa would happen that the Persians would pay a certain tribal leader in which they would pay him to take away Christian influence in the area. It wasn't exactly that they were left behind, but they were being puppeteered by the superpowers at the time. So this left a psychological scar on the Arabian people, in which they were used to downtrod the other empire. Think of them as marauding pirates of the land for hire. But this all changed when Muhammad came onto the scene. He, through the power of Islam and the religion of Islam, had created a consensus in the Arabian mind that through this religion, that success in this life and prospectively in the hereafter, one would be successful in all ventures that they may come upon. So that led to somewhat of a rallying cry. And if we were to couple that with the power of trade that they were accustomed to, that leads to a very somewhat powerful force. I believe one of the poignant moments of Muhammad's life in which the Arabian consensus came into, as one might say, wujud, or come into fruition, is when in the farewell Hajj, when Prophet Muhammad gave a speech in which he said that, go and announce to the people who are not present. I believe this was the pivotal point in when the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, truly took on the idea that to go far and wide and to take this religion to the four corners of the earth, in approximately of a short period of time after the Prophet's death, there was an explosion of the Arabian people on a sense of expansionism within a short period of time, that the Sahabas or even the Tabi'ins, who are people who came after the Sahabas, they reached to the midway through France, and from the other side they reach the tips of Transoxiana, which we call Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. So basically the Soviet satellite states. If you were more interested in this expansionism, I would recommend a very good book by Dr. Yahya Khalid Bliskenship. It's called The End of the Jihad State. I believe that it still wouldn't be able to be achieved if the Arabians were not of the trade-faring type, and because of that they were able to maneuver in the land as others did, but not in the effective sense that they were able to do, just purely out of necessity and survival. So we have now reached a point where the Arabians are now swiftly moving through the earth. Now our story of India really ramps up, in which there are a number of people gunning for India. There are a number of local legends, but not of what I found through books or actual academics, but people's history and so-called legends, which in turn cannot be really verified. For example, the first one is in the state of Gujarat. In Bharuch, there were a number of Sahabas who came to preach the oneness of God, and during that time period that they lived there and they died there, a certain miracle happened after their death, in which their graves were encased in water, in which that the river split in two and re-entered and made a little island in which their graves are. There are a number of other legends and stories in which a number of Sahabas went to Ajmer, and there are a number of other stories that are there. So the most verifiable one I have found is the story of the Kerala king, in which during the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's time, a certain miracle would occur in which that he would split the moon in half. So as we know the story, a number of people of Arabia would ask Muhammad that show us a miracle, in which they asked for a miracle, and the miracle that he showed was the splitting of the moon. But there was a certain individual that saw the splitting of the moon who wasn't really intended for. That was a king from Kerala who saw the splitting of the moon and thought, what is this? So he did his own enquiries and found out about this Prophet Muhammad who was residing in the Hijaz area. And the legend goes that he went during the time period as one might call Mutta, and he accepted the religion of Islam. And after learning about Muhammad, he then proceeded to go back to his own country of Kerala and build a mosque there. There is a mosque there in that location where the king had built the mosque. If anyone wants to see that mosque, and if you're in the Kerala area, you'll be able to see it quite easily if one might want to see it. It's called the Sherman Juma Mosque in Meta in Telkukatar in the Thistle district. That is one of the only ones I can really verify in terms of the first exposure to Islam and Arabia. But we also see that the area of Kerala and the Muslims and the Hindus of that location, their food has also been changed and mixed over and amalgamated into Arabian culture as well. So the use of roasting meats and other types of dishes we see from what they eat. And they say themselves that the dishes that we have are Arabian influence, and we can also see from the differentiating foods that India possesses. Even India has a vast array of dishes and foods and how to prepare them. Kerala seems to be a outlier in that they are quite different in the way that they prepare their food. So we can safely assume that Kerala, it must have been one of the first places of exposure to Islam. So with this information that we have, we could potentially make a composite story out of a generic Sahaba of that time. So I did have a bit where I wrote the story of a potential Sahaba, but it took too much time and resources, which I currently don't have at this current time. So if you were to ask me for the draft piece, I do have draft pieces. Probably in the future I might be able to release that to you. But in a nutshell, the composite story was that a Sahaba would come back from a journey or a trade in which he had to travel to various lands, mainly the land of India. So he would travel as an incense trader. So he would trade some of his items for incense, and then he would go back and forth until he reached back to Mecca, which is his hometown, and learning from this that a large contingency from his friends and families have gone into this new religion. So as his parents are and his brothers and sisters are currently of the original faith of Mecca in terms of the paganistic religion, he tries to get more information out of them. Who is this Muhammad and what does he want? Is he actually from Mecca? So slowly but surely his interest is piqued in that, and then it culminates into an argument and screaming and shouting and fighting, and then he would leave Mecca for Yathrib, in which he would learn about Muhammad, accept his religion, and then he would go back to Mecca during the farewell Hajj, and there would be a confrontation with his family. And then after that, at the end of it, he listens to the final sermon, the farewell Hajj sermon, in which Prophet Muhammad would say that go and announce to the people who are not here. This gives him a beckoning sign in which that I must travel back to India to teach Islam and the religion of Islam and the ways of Islam to the people of India, as they are quite advanced and better than us. If they were to have the knowledge of Islam, they would become a lot of better people than we are. This brings us nicely into what India is in terms of the geographic location of India. So India can be split up into three main areas. First is the Indus Valley area, which would you class as the top of India, and then you got the Gujarat and the coastline of India itself, which you class as the Tamil area, and then the middle bit would class as the Deccan Plateau. As a country or as a place, India has gone through many transitions. So as we know from archaeological evidence, we would class potentially Mohenjo-daro as the one of the actualized first cities upon this earth. And there were other places like Harappa and a number of little minor cities and towns which would model themselves against Mohenjo-daro. Mohenjo-daro in itself is a very interesting subject, as you could see from archaeological evidence that they had advanced city planning and they had running water of some sort and sanitary system of, for example, for toilets. And it looks like they were in the aspect of making social hierarchy as well, as we can deduce from the tiles that have been discovered. But unfortunately, as of right now, the archaeological writing of Mohenjo-daro cannot be deciphered at this current time. But we can see from the pictures that you can see a proto-Hinduism in terms of the picture of the cow and a number of Hindu iconography that we see in the findings of Mohenjo-daro. But after the mysterious fall of Mohenjo-daro, a number of city-states came about, as for example we have the Pallavas and the Sakas and the Pankalas and the Mathuras. A number of kingdoms started to arise, in which, where we look at from the history of India, basically one was trying to make a empire and then it would break again, and then someone else would try to make an empire and then they would break again, and they would shatter into 1,000 city-states in the process. As you can see from the history of China as well, ruling over a vast kingdom is not the easiest task in the world, as we can read from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and other historical documents from China. But India is a very interesting one, in which that through this creating and breaking of empires, the major one that is usually talked to is about the Gupta Empire, and specifically a emperor called Ashoka, a very interesting figure in history as well. If you were to not read about it, then there is a interesting movie in terms of, from a Bollywood perspective, of Mr. Shah Rukh Khan being portrayed as Ashoka himself. As we know that Ashoka was a Hindu king who became a Buddhist and tried to preach the aspects of non-violence and trying to fix problems without the use of force. We know Ahsoka because of his literacy push, and especially in his influence in the Indian language in itself. So once we look at the tail end of the Gupta Empire after he passes away and his son passes away, that we see the new kids on the block, as one might say, and there were around about between the average of 30 kingdoms vying for power. A number of them that you might hear about is Sindh, which is still a type of people today, the Gujaras, who will later become Gujaratis, I presume. And then you've got the Valbais, the Kalachuris, the Cholkayas, and the Gadmabas, and the Aluba, and the Thanusar, and potentially the later Gupta Empire in its smallest capacity. And then you got the Gangas, the Alopas, and Pallavas, and the Mauryas. They are a number of the main players in India at this current time, and they're all vying for power, but with a very interesting twist. If you look at the writings of the time period, you see that the advices to the king specifically that, a good king is not a king that overpowers another king, and who is not overpowered, and it is not a good king to conquer so many lands as it to preserve the status quo. This state of play made India go into a state of stagnation, in which they were satisfied at their current juncture where their lands are at the current time. So there was no new scientific progression, no progression in the arts, no progression in philosophy. It was just keeping up the status quo. But before that, when warfare was actually happening, there was a lot of progression in terms of the arts and science, and the number zero becoming into fruition, and using a number of scientific and religious progressive ideas. There was also another reason why the stagnation occurred as well. One might say it might be a geographical issue as well. So from one side we have the Hindu Kush, which has a number of ranges of mountains, which includes Mount Everest, the largest mountain on earth. So it is very difficult for an ancient army to go across mountains unless you are Hannibal of Carthage. And then from the other side you see the Rajasthani desert, which is quite hospitable. When you have to move a troop of 1,000, 10,000 or 20,000, one has to carry with them provisions, animals, food, water, and a number of logistical issues that may occur in that. So India was safe at the time, but as this new force of Islam that came upon the horizons from the rugged hills of Hijaz, as new kids on the block, they had the vigor and the strength to go the distance. India doesn't seem as safe as it used to be. So we take into perspective Indian history as up to this point, we can safely assume that India did not have very many external forces that has really come to attack India. If you want to know more about India, I recommend two books specifically. One is called India from John Keyes, also a short history of India by Jordan Kerr. Very good and easy to pick up books, and you'll be able to get yourself somewhat up to speed and know like a holistic point of view of what India is and what India became and what is India right now. So let us recap. So we have a place called Arabia, in which a new religion has come forth from a prophet called Muhammad, and a expansionist ideals have come about that the Arabs have to move from one place to the other, to the four corners of the earth, to spread this new religion of Islam. And then you have a country who is going through some level of stagnation because of certain ideals and social norms that have occurred throughout the centuries. One would say that India had it coming somewhat because of their lax attitude. When we look through the history of India, unfortunately this is just a introduction of episode 1. If we were to look into the full history of India, I'm sure that each empire of India could sufficiently cover a full podcast of 10 to 12 episodes, 1 hour each. But as we are right now, we are just introducing the characters of our story that we are trying to tell in this podcast. So we'll leave it for now today. So at this current juncture, we have experienced the death of Muhammad and the 4 caliphs, and we have reached the Umayyad dynasty, in which there is still a sense of expansionism and going as far as we can go. So we can now harken back to Mecca, where it all began, the Hijaz area, and we go to a small town called Taif, in which a boy is training to be a warrior by the name of Muhammad bin Qasim. And that's the introduction of our next episode, where we'll look at the first proper penetration into India by Islamical forces. So when we get to episode 2, I promise you it'll be more of a structured podcast in which we'll go through more in depth of what the individual did and what are the effects that we are still facing today. So I hope you enjoyed the first episode of our podcast. Hopefully it will be a permanent thing, and if you wish to get involved, I will create a forum or website to how you can get involved. And also, can you support us on our Patreon, in which I can get more books and maybe able to expand on this idea, maybe go into video, or maybe going on location to these areas where battles took place and cities in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh. I may be able to go, and hopefully we can expand on the idea and chronologically order the history of India from a Muslim perspective. Hope to hear from you soon in the next episode of Muslim Perspectives in India. Thank you.